The Millennia Stories of Brian Aldiss and Hegelian Perspective. And today's reading is from John chapter 20, verse 17 to 18. And Jesus saith unto her, touch me not. You will see the relevance of that later. Oh, bugger. It's come to my attention that on occasion I've been misspelling the word millennia. I wouldn't make a very good proofreader, I admit it. But it's probably due to the fact that I knew things would start going wrong when the letters fell off my Hegel hat, you know. But I've got a replacement now, so there should be no more mistakes. Not spelling mistakes anyway, not simple grammatical errors, that kind of thing. But there may be plenty of philosophical mistakes, which I hope you will point out if you've noticed any. But I still have my James Joyce t-shirt. And biliousness has been biliousness during millions of millenniums, and our mixed racings have been giving 2 hoots or 3 jeers for the grape, vine, and brew. That is actually very relevant to what I'm about, because the story that I'm on to now, the sterile millennia, is actually about mixed races as well as millenniums. So a very appropriate choice, if I may say so myself. Anyway, there's a lot to get through, so here we go. Starting with Hegel. The true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence constituting itself through its development. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result. That's important. That only in the end is it what it truly is, and that precisely in this consists its nature, viz. To be actual, subject to spontaneous becoming of itself. Though it may seem contradictory that the absolute should be conceived essentially as a result, it needs little pondering to set this show of contradiction in its true light. The beginning, the principle, or the absolute, as at first immediately enunciated, is only the universal, just as when I say all animals. This expression cannot pass for a zoology, so it is equally plain that the words, the divine, the absolute, the eternal, etc., do not express what is contained in them, and only such words in fact do express the intuition as something immediate. Whatever is more than such a word over the transition, even the transition to a mere proposition, contains a becoming other that has to be taken back, or is a mediation. That is, that it is just this that is rejected with horror, as if absolute cognition were being surrendered when more is made of mediation than is simply saying that it is nothing absolute and is completely absent in the absolute. The world spirit, or the absolute. The object of knowledge is the whole. Some wholes are complex entities that possess more inclusivity than others, which leads us to the notion of an absolute whole. The properties of the perspective of philosophy is this broadest possible context. How could such a thing as the whole be known? What is it to know the whole philosophically? Such knowing is by dialectic, but we must discard any explication of this through the notion of or and formulation of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, because this is not Hegel. It derives from Johann Gottlieb Fichte. It is a mode of thinking obviously found in Marxism, which I will come back to later, but it is too mechanical, too precise, too tidy to be true to the spirit of Hegel. Hegel does refer to it as the rhythm of knowledge in reference to Kant, and in my reading, all my reading of Kant, this is the only time I've come across him mentioning thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This is from the lectures on the history of philosophy. But besides the general idea of synthetic judgments a priori, a universal which has difference in itself Kant's instinct carried this out in accordance with the scheme of triplicity, unspiritual though that was, in the whole system into which, for him, the entire universe was divided. This he not only practiced in the three critiques, that's his critique of pure reason, of judgment, and of practical reason, but he also followed it out in most of the subdivisions under the categories, the ideas of reason, etc. Kant has therefore set forth as a universal scheme the rhythm of knowledge, of scientific movement, and has exhibited on all sides thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, modes of the mind by means of which it is mind, and thus consciously distinguishing itself. There is no method of dialectical philosophy, no general prescription or rule for making the dialectical transitions, any which way you can. We know what is meant by dialectical transition, but there is no method for carrying it out. There are simply certain ideas to the fore that direct such transitions. One such idea, one that may be regarded as the central meaning of dialectic, is the idea of opposition, negativity, and its resolution. When I am doing any thinking, which I do sometimes, there will always be some starting point, some phi. I just use the Greek letters, don't know why. That, probably because one of my tutors at university was always using Greek letters like this, so anyway, these sort of influences rub off. When I am doing any thinking, there will always be some starting point, phi, that which is or that about which I think. I may characterize phi through some root simplistic description, and yet phi will always have a relation to a psi. It's another Greek letter. This psi being some inclination of phi, or thing that is needed in order to complete phi. Psi is a negation, and other than phi, that opposes and endeavours to set boundaries upon phi, and yet this opposition, albeit real enough, is neither conclusive nor final. It can be overcome in the negation of the negation. This is an example of when Hegel speaks of a negation here from the science of logic. What ought to be is, and at the same time is not. If it were, it would not be what merely ought to be. The ought has therefore a restriction, essentially. This restriction is not anything alien. That which only ought to be is a determination now posited as it is, in fact, namely, as at the same time only a determinateness. The being in itself of the something is thus reduced in the determination to the ought, because the very thing that constitutes the something's in itselfness is in one and the same respect as non-being, or again, because in itselfness, in the negation of the negation, the said being in itself is as one negation, what negates a unity with the other, and this other as qualitatively other, is the limit by virtue of which the unity is as reference to it. A subject is reflectively what it is by negating that its predicate, otherwise qualitatively other than it is, truly another. The subject is that predicate as other. It negates the predicate as a would-be other, that is, as a negative with respect to it. Hence the subject is reflectively what the predicate is qualitatively, that is, immediately. It is what the predicate is, but at a distance, so to speak. Its self-identity, the negation of the negation that constitutes its eternal being, is thereby modified by carrying a reference to the would-be qualitatively independent to the would-be qualitatively independent predicate. The latter is what the subject ought to be, what it is destined or said to be. The opposition or otherness is seen to be necessary to X on the one hand, and yet in reinterpretation on the other. The term for this transition is, when I say X there, I mean phi. I put X there out of habit. See, it's getting confusing now. The opposition to or otherness is seen to be necessary to phi on the one hand, and yet in need of reinterpretation on the other. The term for this transition is Aufheben. a word carrying three meanings in the manner of an intricate philosophical paronomasia, or pun. I just like saying paronomasia. The literal meaning of the term is to lift up, thereby suggesting that the psi, otherness, is shifted to a new context beneath a new heading. The second sense is to abolish, whereby that which is abolished is the opposition or appearance of incompatibility of the pair. The third sense carries the meaning of preserving their otherness. Their distinctness is preserved at the same time that their putative opposition is annulled. Lifting up in order to integrate and reorder. One opts for a new context, one relatively more complete, and a new organizing perspective under a new subordinate concept. Dialectic is the means of giving expression to the constructing and setting forth of the whole. It demonstrates the parts in their interconnection as forming the whole. It demonstrates what is the differentiated whole. The whole is comprehended through the recognition of its highest order principle as the connection of thread running through the variety of elements that compose the whole, and by seeing this principle as giving these elements the position that they possess. Philosophical knowing is knowing the whole dialectically. The whole is the whole of spirit, which is Geist. The object of philosophic knowledge is the totality or whole constructed by spirit. Spirit primarily refers to human activity and is therefore not akin to a Cartesian thinking substance, but is something concrete. But although spirit is a collective term, referring to all human activity, it is not a collection, an enumerate set of all phi's and psi's and pi's. That's another Greek letter, pi's. Phi's and psi's and pi's, and so on. I'm getting hungry now. It is all human activity conceived as the activity of one thing, one subject. It is a subject extended through time and space, a subject with many different kinds of functions or activities, an embodied and concrete set of activities that are in need of mental predicates to complete their description. Just like individual subjects, you and me. We are individual subjects. The activities of the subject are extended through time and space, incorporating different bodies, an infant, a young man and woman, an aged man and woman, and yet they are united, integrated as one person or one self that includes or is in need of or anticipates in future unrealized and indeterminate activities as a component of its self-definition. The model for spirit is the individual human person or self, but spirit cannot in the end be defined by metaphors and models. Spirit is what spirit is and can be conceived in terms of agency, result, becoming totality, awareness. Spirit is activity, doing, process, and as such it involves agency. Spirit is that which acts, it brings things about. Spirit is elemental vitality. Spirit is that which gets done. It is result, the doing of that which is done, together with the consequences or effects of what gets done and the product of what gets done. Because as we said in the quotation I opened with, Hegel says that the absolute is a result. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result. Human activity is a pattern of behaviour, a something done, and a something doing. Human activity can be seen from the perspective of agent and result. That can be distinguished but not separated. Human activity references both. It is true of any subject. I exist as what I am in my doing and the result of my doing. Such is my way of being, my defining of myself. Being is doing is doing something. I am what I do, the result of what I do, which implicates a self-reflexivity. I become something different in doing something different. I grow and develop. For instance, I learned how to spell Millennia. Consistently anyway, because I do really know how to spell it. I just make mistakes. I learned how to spell Millennia consistently. My being is what I have been and what I become. Spirit is a system, a unified and self-organizing set of activities that becomes differentiated and developed over time. Spirit is a totality, a whole of human activity, a result of agency, which alters and develops. It absorbs new characteristics and stages into what it does. Spirit acts and creates the whole and is self-aware. Spirit is aware of itself as not only agent, but as result, aware of itself as a system, person or subject. In Hegelian terms, it is in it and for itself, the world that spirit makes. I put it that way, the world that spirit makes, because I'm a Philip K. Dick fan. And you might know one of his novels is called The World That Jones Made. So that's where these things work in your subconscious, The world in which spirit finds itself and defines itself and recognizes what is there as itself as the result of human activity as spirit. It is then that the circle closes. Agent and result are brought together as an infinity or a self-contained totality, a self, a world self, and once this is done, spirit is absolute, albeit this is not attained merely at any point or at any time, for it belongs to the fullness of time when a totality has come to exist and can be demonstrated to exist by dialectical philosophy, or speculative philosophy more precisely, I suppose. The closing of the circle is the absolute spirit, absolute idea, agent and result are reconciled. The totality is the work of spirit. Spirit is and is only what it does, and dialectical philosophy is the form of the full self-construction, self-definition of spirit in its form as an actual organized totality. Dialectical philosophy is absolute knowledge. So, to give an idea what I'm talking about, this is a quote at the end of Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history. Thus it happens that in virtue of elements of universality which have the principle of spirit as their basis, the empire of thought is established actually and concretely. The antithesis of church and state vanishes. The spiritual becomes that's it. That'll be important later, by the way, the church and state. When I'm getting onto the Aldiss story, the spiritual becomes reconnected with the secular and develops this latter as an independently organic existence. The state no longer occupies a position of real inferiority to the church and is no longer subordinate to it. The latter asserts no prerogative, and the spiritual is no longer an element foreign to the state. Freedom has found the means of realizing its ideal, its true existence. This is the ultimate result which the process of history is intended to accomplish, and we have to traverse in detail the long track which has been this cursorily traced out, yet length of time is something entirely relative, and the element of spirit is eternity, duration, properly speaking, cannot be said to belong to it. So, human history is a single whole, the work of the world historical spirit, a self-organizing process. The historical forms or stages or species of life differ in kind, and each as a social system of acting is a distinct and alternate exemplar of self-organized human activity, and the genus or thread idea running through these stages or species, that is spirit, is identified with the highest of these species. However, the genus is open-ended in virtue of permitting alternate yet unrealized future stages and developments. Thus, this considered, it is teleological in two ways. There is an end or provisional actuality. The developmental sequence is progressive. There is an actual movement of stages in time, in that a later stage depends upon the development of an earlier stage or form of life. And yet, the account is not put principally in terms of later and earlier, but rather of higher and lower. Development is not in essence temporal in nature, albeit incorporates time as a feature, and the sense in which social systems of behaviour are said to develop is one of evaluation, whereby that which evolves into something better or higher. This is a dialectical notion of development. The development of the forms of life it is cumulative. like the production of sex robots, of which I'm still waiting for one. Each model differs from another, but the technological skills required for ultimate satisfaction are cumulative, as are the ideals associated with sex robots. The highest form of the genus is the model that best exemplifies the accumulated technological skills and the sex robot ideals that have been built into the whole process. And yet this is not of necessity the final model. The final model which gives for you the ultimate in sexual experience. We must allow for next year's model giving even more satisfaction. The series is open-ended. I'd be happy with just the first model, actually. In that the genus can have further members, but there is no form of the genus beyond its highest actuality. What counts? There's a lot of typographical errors here, despite the fact that I'd say there wouldn't be any. What counts as ultimate satisfaction? There is no model beyond the latest model or beyond the best model thus far, for were there such, she would already have been built. Consider the case whereby sex robots make themselves. The skills and ideas are internally generated in production. They know all about sex. Then you would have spirit, self-moving, self-organizing. The example is not perfect and may appear to invoke Marxist resonances with factories, resonances and overtones of factories, assembly lines, and so on. Albeit Marxist, you'll know this if you've ever read Adorno, tend to resent the hoi polloi being diverted by capitalist-generated enjoyment, as it forestalls the revolution. But it serves to clarify an important question. What is it that is being produced in world history that is analogous to sex robots? That is the ultimate question. Spirit or humanity? And human is? That's the title of another Philip K. Dick story, as you probably know. Human is. Human is what? Actually, first thing about it, Philip K. Dick defined humanity in terms of empathy, which I suppose could relate to what's coming. Hegel said that in the Asiatic world, only one man is free, which is a despot. In the Greek and Roman world, only a few men are free, the citizens. But in the modern, which for him was the Germanic world, all men are free. The history of the world is not other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. A progress whose development, according to the necessity of its nature, it is our business to investigate. The general statement of the various grades in the consciousness of freedom, and which we applied in the first instance to the fact that the Eastern nations knew only that one is free, the Greek and Roman world only that some are free, whilst we know that all men, absolutely, man as man, are free, supplies us with the natural division of universal history and suggests the mode of its discussion. This is remarked, however, only incidentally and anticipatively. Some other idea must be first explained. The destiny of the spiritual world, and since this is a substantial world, while the physical remains subordinate to it, or, in the language of speculation, has no truth as against the spiritual, the final cause of the world at large we allege to be the consciousness of its own freedom on the part of spirit, and, ipso facto, the reality of that freedom. Being free means what? Does being free carry some denotation like being philosophical, free from ignorance, having inner spiritual freedom, living in a state of political freedom? All such are contents of freedom as determinations of the idea of freedom, and so we can take these determinate contents as being in history from the beginning and as enlarging and developing in the course of history. How is any such content established? Is the point about political freedom an inductive one, or is it a priori? If it is inductive, then how may the strong claims about the future upon which Hegel's position depends be made? After all, the claim is that a particular motif will continue to play a dominant historical role. Furthermore, induction is haunted by objectivity and perspective, to which ordinary historical accounts are heir to. But as for the a priori option, we can but speculate how a definite content, which is merely the way things happen to be, can be established a priori. Details are bothersome. Matters of fact are to be determined upon a priori grounds. Maybe the issue of content is correctly posited not in respect to freedom, as to what its content is, but in respect to spirit. Freedom of spirit is just that content. Whatever it is, that spirit does in fact incorporate. Freedom is an empty notion prior to spirit, giving it filling. Freedom is the self-definition of spirit, is the self-assertion of spirit, but is the self-definition of spirit in any way limited? Are some forms inauthentic for spirit? Freedom has a history, a definite content, is not incompatible with the contention that spirit's content is freedom, in that it is whatever spirit posits. Freedom is not what spirit does in history, but the condition of spirit in the world, its manner of doing whatever it does, and what it does is to build up the humanity of man and woman as actually in the world. What spirit builds into the world, and hence what man and woman becomes, is what happens to be. There is a common humanity that emerges and evolves in history, not simply as a set of ideals, but in addition as a set of institutional and social configurations suited to such ideals. Such an emerging consciousness is in need of two conditions in order to be world historical: a consistent thread or tradition at work, and it would need to be a collective thing, the work of all men and women, or of some men and women in the interest of all. In order for it to be spiritual, it needs to deal with the central issue of being human. It needs to deliver an existential, a lived and collectively lived answer to the question, what is it to be human? And thus we get to grips with philosophical perspective upon human history. Philosophy assists us in looking at the facts of history under the species of spirit. What is the character and limit of the philosophical assessment of forms of spirit or ways of life? What is the nature of world historical causality? The assessment of the grand ideological social systems that have embodied a sense of humanity in history is given in terms of reason. The philosopher endeavours to identify the generic informing historical concept, the concrete meaning of the term, what it is to be human, and to perceive it exemplified by degrees in the different ways of life. The philosopher is to demonstrate the evolution of the sense of a common humanity, and to determine its highest form. The assessment of higher and lower involves demonstrating that the form at issue is an emergence from previous forms in two respects. First, in that it resolves certain problems inherent in an earlier stage, problems that could not be resolved there but were identified there. Second, in that it is novel, a transcendence of earlier forms. Such philosophical analysis is not logically different from dialectic, but the philosopher's capability to provide a dialectical account is a sort of justification for his or her contention that the whole at issue is a totality and that the principle of the emergent form is a subordinate in it. The emergent or new form is rational in a functional sense, in that it is problem-solving. It is a problem-solving form that emerges out of a problematic situation, and yet it has a basic cumulative and consolidated continuity with previous forms, so that to the extent the new form manages to resolve particular inherited problems, its ends, the ends of the highest emergent form thus far, are normatively rational for all the lower stages of that system. Thereby do we discover reason in history. The philosophical statement about these forms of the world spirit is always from a point of view, the perspective of the present. The assessment is of necessity relative and provisional, given that it is in ignorance with regard to the details of the future, and the system of the world spirit is an emerging one, and its ends are determinate only so far, so the pronouncements of world historical reason by philosophers are always reflective and retrospective. Hence we have this famous quote from the philosophy of right: as the thought of the world, that's philosophy, appears only when actuality is already there, cut and dried after its process of formation has been completed, when philosophy paints its grey on grey, then has a shape of life grown old. By philosophy's grey on grey, it cannot be rejuvenated but only understood. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of dusk. Philosophical world historical reason is of the nature of an exposition showing the manifold of forms and how they relate to one another, and the philosopher, as its spokesperson, delivers such assessments upon the foundation of internal standards through reference to the standards that get built up and that evolve in the process of world history itself. The history of the world and the career of the world spirit raises the question of the causality involved in assessing its rationality, a form of life that has emerged and has been retrospectively assessed as rational, has rationality not merely in the standard that it provides for judgments, but in addition in the motive that is provided for men and women for its emergence to begin with. Problems. The emergence of this form could not have been rational in the critical sense, for reason is retrospective, and the end or set of functions that will serve to define what is rational has not yet in the present case come into being, and until there is an actual, and there is no way of knowing what is rational. So that which is emerging cannot be in its becoming, according to reason, neither can it be stirred by a notion of any end, which is in truth rational, in the world historical sense. Furthermore, the actions undergone to bring such a way of life about are taken by individual persons. In human action, the large-scale collective result, the way of life itself, is unintended, that is, unintended by the whole range of individual agents, who have a variety of aims. Maybe the result was not intended by anyone. Intentionality is individual, and the impulse to act is particular interests. The collective result, an emergent form of life, is an amalgamation formed out of such particular impulses and interests. That same one of man, or some few as it happens, will this end, is, if it is a fact, only an incident in a bigger picture, and the individual agent is never, nor can be directed, by world historical rationality. This latter, however, and of necessity has the form of retrospective judgment on a large-scale collective result. The particular and partial is the unintentional and unwitting agent of the rational whole. The particular and partial is the unintentional and unwitting agent of the rational whole. This is the cunning of reason. But it may be objected that the absence of reason in the emergent becoming of history is not a matter of cunning, but a gap in the Hegelian system. Curse the need, I say, for a theory of causality to account for the emergence of the collective forms or social system, and to connect the causal mechanism with world historical reason. After all, the actual is the rational, and reason rules the world. So, the sterile millennia. This is from the short story. A point exists in war after which the conflict seems to protract itself almost of its own accord, for when men have lost homes, wives, families, businesses, or whatever else they hold dear, they can see nothing but to fight on, either through hatred or indifference. Year succeeded year. Sometimes the killing was slight, sometimes heavy. The gains were always negligible. There followed a curious period when little exhausted groups of people isolated themselves from their fellows, either intentionally or through indifference. This happens along racial lines in the story, by the way, but I haven't focused on that because I didn't see it as relevant, although it might be, I suppose. Mental and physical exhaustion is the hallmark of the ensuing long sterile millennia. Even those drives which up until now had seemed to play a dominant role in man's affairs, the erotic and the predatory, suffered diminution. Everywhere silence fell. The tottering economic agricultural system was propped for several centuries by a vast array of robots, which drew from the land all that the land was capable of yielding. Obviously not sterile robots, well, there might have been sex robots, but this is the sterile millennium. The notorious mating centre was set up, governing all marriages and births. Only an age without hope could have tolerated its arid regimen. Now this follows on from Aldiss's war millennia, right? Now I need to make some points about Hegel's view on war, which perhaps I should have brought up last time. Because in this he has been misrepresented. Here's a quote from a remark in the Philosophy of Right. This is not part of the main text, it's just a remark. War is not to be regarded as an absolute evil, but by its agency, as I have remarked elsewhere, the ethical health of the peoples is preserved in their indifference to the stabilization of finite institutions, and just as the blowing of the winds preserves the sea from the foulness which would be the result of a long calm, so also corruption in nations would be the result of prolonged, let alone perpetual peace. That reference to perpetual peace, he is thinking of Kant, who wrote a treatise on perpetual peace, but he also mentions it in the Metaphysics of Morals. The best constitution is one where the laws, not the human beings, are in power. For what can be more metaphysically sublimated than precisely this idea? Yet it has, according to their own assertion, the most proven objective reality, which can also easily be demonstrated in particular cases. This idea should not be brought about in a revolution, in one leap. That is, through a violent overthrow of a previously existing faulty constitution, for then a moment would occur in the meantime where the entire juridical condition was nullified. Rather, it must be attempted and carried out through gradual reform, according to fixed principles, and only it can direct us to a continual approach toward the higher political good, perpetual peace. Now, in the Philosophy of Right, Hegel went on to say, in peace, civil life continually expands, all its departments wall themselves in, and in the long run, men stagnate. This is where we get to. Their idiosyncrasies become continually more fixed and ossified, but for health, the unity of the body is required, and if its parts harden themselves into exclusiveness, that is, death, as a result of war, nations are strengthened, but people involved in civil strife also require peace at home through making wars abroad. War produces insecurity of property, but this insecurity of things is nothing but their transience, which is inevitable. The fact remains that wars occur when the necessity of the case requires. Hegel did not believe that a nation that is unprovoked has the right to attack another nation, if it regards such an attack to be for the benefit of its own ethical health. War is not to be regarded as an absolute evil. Force and coercion, taken abstractly, is wrong. Coercion is annulled by coercion. Coercion is thus shown to be not only right under certain conditions, but necessary, that is, as a second act of coercion, which is the annulment of one that has preceded. If a small nation is attacked by a greater, it has to defend itself against the aggressor. Thereby war, as an act of coercion on its own part, is right. It is not an absolute evil. It occurs when the necessity of the case requires. Considered in abstraction, war may well be wrong. As an empirical condition, it is on occasion right. Excerpts from Hegel's remark that I gave earlier on war and ethic health are provided by Karl Popper in his dishonest travesty, I can't stand this book, The Open Society as Enemies, or Enemies, perhaps more apt, where he argues that this remark affords a good instance of the identification of the moral with the healthy, of ethics with political hygiene. There's the typo there. I think we should say a good instance of the identification of the morality of war with the healthy ethics of political hygiene, or of right with might. He provides no other citations from Hegel's ideas on war. One can forgive one philosopher for misunderstanding another, because that happens all the time. I'm sure I misunderstand Hegel. Unless it is due to sloppiness, not actually reading the philosopher in question, or if it is deliberate misrepresentation or cherry-picking to prove some dogmatic point they are already enamored by, it is best to eschew emotive language in philosophical discourse and keep it rational. But, being chivalrous, I make an exception in the case of the likes of Popper, those who treat lady philosophy so abominably, taking her rudely from behind and forcibly giving a jolly good. But I digress. Here are some citations to give a fuller picture of Hegel's views on war and the state. This, however, the idea that corruption in nations would follow from prolonged peace, is said to be only a philosophical idea or a justification of providence, and it is maintained that actual wars require some other justification. This is from the Philosophy of Right again. The substantial welfare of the state is its welfare as a particular state in its specific interest and situation, and its no less special foreign affairs, including its particular treaty relations. Its government, therefore, is a matter of particular wisdom, not of universal providence. Similarly, its aim in relation to other states and its principle for justifying war and treaties is not a universal thought, the thought of philanthropy, but only its actually injured or threatened welfare as something specific and peculiar to itself. If states disagree and their particular wills cannot be harmonized, the matter can only be settled by war. A state through its subjects has widespread connections and many-sided interests, and these may be readily and considerably injured, but it remains inherently indeterminable which of these injuries is to be regarded as a specific breach of treaty or as an injury to the autonomy and injury of the state. The reason for this is that the state may regard its honour at stake in each of its concerns, and it is all the more inclined to susceptibility to injury the more its strong individuality is impelled, as a result of long domestic peace, to seek and create a sphere of activity abroad. Hegel is offering a description, not a prescription. He also says in the Philosophy of Right, the state is no the state. Oh God, this is such an important quote. That should say, the state is no ideal work of art. It stands on earth, and so in the sphere of caprice, chance, and error, and bad behaviour may disfigure it in many ways. Note, he said the state is no ideal work of art. He did not believe that whatever is right. War frequently disfigures the state. War is the state of affairs when rights disappear and force and chance hold sway. Hence, in war itself is characterized as something which ought to pass away. It implies, therefore, the proviso of the jus gentium, that the possibility of peace be retained. The European peoples form a family in accordance with the principle underlying their legal codes, their customs, their civilization. The principle has modified their conduit in a state of affairs that is war, otherwise dominated by mutual infliction of evils. This is from the philosophy of religion. Most living things base their existence on the destruction of another's life. The same applies to the loftier aims. When we've traversed the realms of morality up to its highest stage, the life of the state, and watch whether its purposes are fulfilled or not, we certainly will experience that many are, but more, even the greatest and noblest of them, are spoiled and frustrated through the passions and viciousness of man. And from the philosophy of history, the concrete image of evil, namely war, in its greatest existence, we have before our eyes in the history of the world. If we contemplate the mass of individual events which have happened, it appears to us as a shambles in which individuals and whole peoples are immolated. And from the lectures on aesthetics. Now in Europe each nation is limited by another one, and it should not arbitrarily start a war against another. All the world's tears. Such a poignant little tale. Which was, I think, was amended. I mean, I read from the original 1950s edition. The War Millennia, which was Out of Reach, was another what the story was also originally called, is followed by the Sterile Millennia, All the World's Tears. J. Smithlow, a psychodynamician, visits Charles Gunpat's estate on a routine visit to administer a hate race to the old man. On the way, he catches a glimpse of a man approaching Gunpat's estate on foot. He sees the man from air because he is arriving by air. He supposes this to be a wild man because everything living in this millennium is under control in this sterile world. Hence, there are mating centres. Mating is very much under control. Who mates with who? The old comfortable world, which is on racial lines, incidentally. I haven't really emphasised that part of the story. Maybe I'll do it next time. The old comfortable world of random factors has gone. The countless populations of previous centuries and the leachings of war had exhausted the soil. Only the severest parsimony, coupled with ruthless regimentation, produced enough nourishment for a sparse population. Billions had died of starvation. The hundreds who remained lived on starvation's brink. And the hate race? Well, this is sterile millennia. Hatred needs buttressing. Gunpat is a difficult man to rouse, but Smithlow works on him as the expert that he is, to get a rise out of him. And he tries many kinds of insult. Why, when it was your turn to go up to the mating centre, you didn't even realise that it's the one time a man has to come out from behind a screen. You thought you could make love by TV, and the result? One dotty daughter. One dotty daughter, Gunpat. Doesn't it make you weep? Think how your rivals at Automotion must titter at that. Patty Gunpat and his dotty daughter, they'll be saying. Can't control your genes, they'll be saying. Gunpat insists that there's nothing wrong with his daughter Ploy, other than she's a recessive, which Smithlow himself had acknowledged. A recessive? Smithlow sneered. How far back can you recede? She's gentle. Do you hear me? You with the hair in your ears? She wants to love. He bellowed with ironic laughter. Why, it's obscene. Goody boy. She couldn't hate to save her life. She's no better than a primitive. She's worse than a primitive. She's mad. As he is leaving the estate, Smithlow spots Ploy Ploy at the back of the house. Except for her delicate pink lips, her face was utterly pale. Her hair was black. It hung straight, secured only once at the back of her head, and then fell in a tail to her waist. She looked mad indeed, her melancholy eyes peering towards the great elms, as if they would scorch down everything in their line of vision. Smithlow turned to see what she stared at so compellingly. The wild man that he observed from the air was breaking through the thicket surrounding elm boles. Now the wild man was in danger from the surrounding gardening robots, but they became inactive because of consulting amongst each other on what to do. Logic, that was the trouble. It was all robots had to go on, to go by. Man had logic and intelligence. He got along better than his robots. Nevertheless, he was losing the battle against nature, and nature, like the robots, used only logic. That's good Hegelianism there, you know. If you've read his philosophy of nature. It was a paradox against which man could not prevail. The wild man had been drawing upon all of his resources for a whole year to find his way to Ploy Ploy, and eventually they touch. The hand the wild man extended to her was lifted to her cheek. She stood unflinchingly on the grey terrace, her head high, and so his loving fingers gently brushed her countenance. The explosion was almost instantaneous. Smithlow, of course, saw the light side of this. So it was not quite the sterile agent. Yes, thought Smithlow, turning away. You had to admit it was neat and again logical. In a world on the brink of starvation, how else stop undesirables from breeding? Logic against logic. Man pitted against nature's. Man pitted against nature's logic. That was what caused all the tears of the world. Now Ploy Ploy would have known what would happen. She had chosen to die that way. Which we now bring in, perhaps rather unexpectedly, Christian atheist Slavoj Zizek. Touch me not, according to John 20:17, is what Jesus said to Mary Magdalene, when she recognized him after his resurrection. How do I, an avoid Christian atheist, understand these words? He wrote this, as you can see from the title there, whilst we were all in lockdown during the COVID epidemic. First, I take them together with Christ's answer to his disciples' question as to how we will know that he is returned and resurrected. Christ says he will be there whenever there is love between his believers. He will be there not as a person to touch, but as the bond of love and solidarity between people. So, do not touch me. Touch and deal with other people in the spirit of love. Which is what Ploy Ploy should have done with the wild man, obviously. Christianity is much more atheist than the usual atheism, which can claim there is no God and so on, but nonetheless it retains a certain trust into the big other. The big other can be called natural necessity, nature's logic, you see, evolution or whatever. We humans are nonetheless reduced to a position within the harmonious whole of evolution, whatever, but the difficult thing to accept is again that there is no big other, no point of reference which guarantees meaning. Now, of course, Zizek, Christian atheist, true to form, is being misdirected here by his Christian atheism. Where can we find meaning in a sterile age? The answer may surprise you. Or perhaps not. I shouldn't be so presumptuous. Maybe you'll find it stupid, but I will get onto that later. To be continued.